So the next topic I want to talk about is the really cool one. In October of 2015, Microsoft announced the public preview of Azure AD Domain Services. Now, what Azure AD Domain Services is, it's an Azure-hosted Active Directory for use with applications and virtual machines in Azure. It's a replacement, for example, for an Azure IaaS domain controller virtual machine. It supports complex schema extensions. It supports domain join, LDAP, Kerberos, NTLM, GPOs for VMs on a specified Azure virtual network. It can function as a full DNS server for an Azure virtual network, and it works with Azure AD Connect. Your general takeaway is that you no longer need to go and put a VM into Azure running as a domain controller. Azure will now do that in a software as a service function. But rather than me just telling you about it, let me give you a demo of Azure Active Directory Domain Services. In this demo, we're going to install and configure Azure AD Domain Services, and then we're going to join an Azure Infrastructure as a Service VM to an Azure domain, and then log on with one of the accounts that we've configured for that. So let's get into it. So here we are back in the Azure console. I click on the Pluralsight subscription. I go across to configure, and what I need to do is I need to turn on this particular domain for domain services. So I go yes. I'm okay with the name pluralsight.onmicrosoft.com, and I have to specify a subnet into which to project that Active Directory domain instance. You must have a subnet specified before you can do this. All I need to do now is I need to click Save. And when I do that, what will happen is basically an IP will be assigned as a DNS server, and this will represent the domain controller. So you can see here it's 10.0.0.4. So I go back, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to configure that virtual network, that Sydney virtual network, to actually use 10.0.0.4 as a DNS server in Azure. So I add that here. I specify the IP address, 10.0.0.4 here. And then I just have to give it a name. And this name can be anything really. It doesn't really matter. So I've just said ps-dns. I click Save. It updates the network. So we've got our network in place. Next thing I need to do is, of course, if I want to join an Azure VM to AD, I need to go and create a virtual machine. So I'm going to create a virtual machine from the gallery. And in this case, I'm going to use Windows Server 2016 Technical Preview 3. I'm going to call it Pluralsight 2. I'm going to specify my local administrator name as Chancellor. You can see I kind of like that name. I provide a password for the local administrator account. I click Next. Now the key here, I've got to make sure that this VM is deployed on the Sydney virtual network. Remember, that's the one I'm projecting as your Active Directory Domain Services into. I click OK, and it goes and creates that virtual machine for me. So I've done a little bit of editing here, and what we're doing is we're now connecting to that fully ready virtual machine. I log on as Chancellor with that password because this is a local administrator account. So this is still a standalone virtual machine at this point in time. So I click yes, and I make my connection, and I sign on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick check of the IP address and look for the DNS address as well. So I'm going to run a command prompt, do an IP config, and we see we've got 10.0.0.5, but that doesn't tell me my DNS server address. So let's just do a more detailed IP config. And I can see here that my DNS server address is 10.0.0.4. Great. So what I'm going to do, knowing that the DNS server is correctly configured for this, is I'm going to try and join it to Active Directory. So I can go down to Properties of this PC. I can click on Advanced System Settings. I then click on Computer Name. I click Change. I specify the domain name, which as we know is pluralsight.onmicrosoft.com. Click OK. Now I need to provide the username of an account that's got domain administrator privileges. So I'll try Chancellor, and I'll put Chancellor's password in because remember I did have that Chancellor account for that Azure AD instance. But I get the username or passwords incorrect. And there's a few more things I need to do to get this working. The first thing I need to do is I need to go back into Azure AD. I'm going to add a new user. I'm going to call this one captain@pluralsitus.onmicrosoft.com. And this is sort of going to function as my domain administrator account, Captain. And I'll set his user to global admin, although this actually doesn't matter as much. And I will specify my oren.pluralsite account as the password reset account. Of course, once I've created that user, next thing we know I need to do is I need to go and reset his password because I can't go and use that default password, can I? So an easy way of doing that is spinning up an in-private browsing version of Internet Explorer and trying to sign on to the Azure Management Console, which will, of course, allow me to reset my password. So I sign on captain@pluralsitus.onmicrosoft.com, click continue, looks for the account. I put in that temporary password. I click sign in. It comes back and says, well, you need to change your password. So I put in the temporary password. And then I put in my new password. And of course, Captain is not an Azure administrator, so he can't get in there. So I come back to the directory. Next thing I need to do is I need to create a special group. Now this might change when this RTMs, but what you need to do is you need to basically create the equivalent of a domain admins group. So what I do here is I click add group, and the name of the group you've got to create is AAD-DC administrators. And this is very important. This group must exist within the directory. You can provide a description for it, Azure AD domain admins. And now what I need to do is I need to add some accounts to that group. So one of the accounts I'll add will be that Captain account I just created. But let's go crazy and add a whole lot of accounts. Don't recommend doing this in real life. This is also because this is a fairly, well, it's only a week old in public preview when I'm recording this course. So this is why it doesn't necessarily always work as intended. So I click OK, and that group's now created and populated. Fantastic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my virtual machine. So I go up to virtual machines, I click on virtual machines, I click Pluralsight 2, I click connect, I get my remote desktop file, I click open, I click connect. Now I put in Chancellor because remember Chancellor is still also the name of the local administrator account on that standalone VM at the moment. Sign on there. So we're back on as Chancellor. So now we're going to try the domain join. So what we do is we put captain@pluralsitus.onmicrosoft.com as our account name. Then we put in our password. We click OK. And Eureka, I am now made that virtual machine a member of the pluralsitus.onmicrosoft.com domain. So it has now joined an Azure Active Directory Domain Services instance. There's no domain controller VM here, people. This is all Active Directory in the cloud. So I restart that machine because that's what you've got to do when you're doing a domain join. I'm going to reconnect. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect as captain.pluralsitus.onmicrosoft.com. Remember that's an Azure AD account. I'm logging onto a virtual machine with that just to prove to you that this is actually properly domain joined. So I click OK. I can log in as Captain. So I'm logging in to a machine with that Azure AD account that's running in Azure. Now, to go one step further, we know that we've got Active Directory in the cloud. What's something else we can do? Well, we can go and look at that Active Directory with Active Directory users and computers. So what I'm doing here is I'm installing the RSAT tools, the Remote Server Administration tools. This is a feature in Windows Server that allows you to remotely administer different roles and services on Windows servers, which of course will include Active Directory users and computers, which will allow me to manage ADDS in the cloud. So I click Next. I'm installing everything, so it's adding a whole lot of other components I probably don't need. It's installed. I click Close. I go to the Tools menu. I select Active Directory users and computers. And now I am connecting to that Azure instance. So here we see pluralsitus.onmicrosoft.com, looks like a normal domain. I can click on ADDC users. I can click on the normal users container, which of these are all of the users that are existing within that directory. I can go up and click on computers and of course can see pluralsitus number 2. So how cool is that? Active Directory without a domain controller, all sitting as software as a service in the cloud. So in this demo, I showed you installing Azure AD domain services, and I also showed you how to join an Azure IaaS VM to an Azure AD domain.